After you complete the setup of the test fixture, you now need to insert the check standard into the strip line resonator. To do this, we're going to remove the top plate of the resonator by loosening up all 8 screws. We'll leave them in the top plate and then just lift the top plate off. The check standard has a bottom sample piece, it has a bottom shim and a center conductor. These are all identified by being 76.2 millimeters long. The check standard also has a top piece, which is 75.7 millimeters long, and a matching top shim. They get put together in a sandwich so that there is a bottom shim, sample, center conductor, sample, and then the opposite shim. I number these so that the 1 shim is the top shim and the number 2 shim is the bottom. So we put them in the fixture, starting with the bottom. The shim goes in first, then the bottom sample, which is the longer of the two. Then we use tweezers to put the center conductor in, both to avoid touching it and just to avoid bending it. Needs to be located approximately in the middle of the sample, more important for it to be parallel to the edge of the fixture. Then we put the top sample piece in, and then we put the top shim in, which I've numbered as number 1 in my stack. We now lift the top plate, put it back in place, and we're going to tighten the screws in a star pattern starting from the middle. At this point, we're putting very little torque on the screws. It's just enough to keep the top plate fixed from shifting. So we're not really putting any force on it. It also is making sure that the top plate is level by doing this star pattern and watching it as we tighten. But we're not putting any significant pressure. We want the left end of the sample to stick out just a little, so it's just barely visible. There should be 1/4 of a millimeter of sample left. The top piece should be flush with the top plate, and the bottom piece and the bottom shim will be sticking out 1/4 of a millimeter. You can see in this picture just barely the center conductor that's lined more or less in the center of that bottom piece. Here's the right edge viewed through the microscope as we go through the alignment process. We're pushing the pieces so that the top shim and the top sample piece are more or less flush with the right edge of the top plate, and then we're going to push or center the bottom piece, which is 1/2 millimeter longer, and the center conductor so it's just visible and extends just a small distance beyond the top piece. Again, as long as the top plate has not been tightened, those slide back and forth easily with inside of their position, and you can see that the center conductor is more or less centered and it extends about 1/4 of a millimeter past the top. This is another view. You can see that there's a gap since the screws have not been tightened, but also shows the orientation of the samples and the center conductor. Once a sample has been centered, now we're going to apply some torque to the screws. Again, we're going to use the same star pattern, working kind of across in an X on the middle, and then we're going to do an X on the outer screws. Do a little bit each time. We're going to make this hand tight using the 9/64 wrench, hex wrench that comes with the kit, or comes with the probe ranger, I should say, and go back and forth a little bit each time until it's finger tight. After each screw is finger tight, we now use the torque wrench that is included so that we get the proper IPC standard force on each of the screws. We need to do 20 inch-pounds of torque on each of the screws. We're going to do it in the exact same star pattern or cross pattern, starting from the center 4 screws, working across diagonally to the opposite one, then going up and diagonally across to the bottom. On each of these, we're letting the torque wrench read 20 inch-pounds by holding it there to make sure that there's no more rotation. After the center 4 are tightened, we do the same thing on the outer 4. Once all of the screws are tight, I go back and look at the microscope image of the sample position to make sure that it's still centered.